Carl Jung and the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Imagine for a moment that you could have a map, but not just any map, a map of your soul. This is exactly what Carl Jung saw when he studied the Tibetan Book of the Dead, a true guide to the human psyche. This ancient sacred text used for centuries in Tibet to guide the soul through the process of death was seen by Jung not as a distant mystical manual, but as a symbolic mirror of the inner transformations we all face throughout life. Carl Jung said, "The Tibetan Book of the Dead impressed me deeply. It shows, in an archetypal way, what happens in the human soul when confronted with the unknown." When Jung wrote the preface for the first Western translation of the book, he recognized a profound parallel with his own psychological approach. The bardo, that state between death and rebirth, could be compared to the critical moments of emotional transition we experience internally. Transitions like the end of a relationship, the loss of a professional identity, or that inexplicable emptiness that arises in the middle of daily life. All these moments, according to Jung, are like little deaths. And each symbolic death demands a rebirth, a new consciousness that can only emerge when we are willing to look inward with courage. Throughout this video, we'll dive into this journey together, understanding how Tibetan wisdom, reinterpreted by Jung, can help us face anxiety not as an enemy, but as a precious sign of imminent transformation. But before we continue, tell me, have you ever felt as if you were between worlds? No longer who you were, and not yet who you want to be? That is your bardo, and today we'll learn how to cross it with awareness. Anxiety from the perspective of analytical psychology. Most people see anxiety as a problem to be eliminated, but what if it were actually a messenger, a signal from the unconscious that something within us is trying to emerge? For Carl Jung, anxiety is not a disease, it is the echo of a conflicted soul, a tension between who we are consciously and what dwells in the depths of our psyche. Carl Jung said, "Anxiety is the necessary suffering for the soul to become conscious." In analytical psychology, this tension arises when we deny aspects of ourselves, repressed desires, ancient fears, unintegrated emotions. The more the unconscious tries to manifest, the more the ego resists. And it is from this silent battle that anxiety is born. Let's make this more tangible. Imagine someone who always wears a smile, always being strong for others. But at night, when everything falls silent, they feel a weight in their chest, an inexplicable tightness. That discomfort may be the muffled cry of their shadow asking to be heard, or think of a professional who has always been the best at what they do. But suddenly, they start feeling an emptiness, a constant restlessness. Perhaps their inner anima, the archetype of sensitivity and feeling, is crying out for space, suffocated by years of logic and control. Jung teaches us that healing does not come from running away from anxiety, but from deciphering the symbolic language behind it. It may indicate that a new path needs to be forged, that a new identity is trying to be born. But for that, we must ask an essential question. What in me is trying to emerge that I haven't yet had the courage to acknowledge? The bardo as a metaphor for the psychic process. At the heart of the Tibetan Book of the Dead is the concept of bardo, an intermediate state, a space between death and rebirth. But Carl Jung saw something even deeper in this concept. The bardo is a powerful metaphor for the moments of psychological transition we all face in life. Think of it this way. The bardo doesn't only happen when the body dies. It happens when an old self begins to die, and the new one has not yet been born. Have you ever experienced this? Maybe after leaving a long-term relationship, or upon realizing that an old dream no longer makes sense, or even waking up on an ordinary day and suddenly feeling like you know longer know who you are. These moments of existential crisis, uncertainty, emptiness are our inner bardos. They are frightening because they force us to abandon the known and walk in the dark. But according to Jung, it is precisely in these in-between moments that the unconscious manifests most strongly. It is there that symbolic dreams appear, that synchronicities occur, that the soul begins to whisper what the ego had refused to hear. Carl Jung said, "The birth of the self is always preceded by a period of darkness." And here's the key. Anxiety arises when we resist this transition process, when we try to hold on to the old, while something new is already knocking at the door. The Tibetan secret and the Jungian secret is not to avoid the bardo, it is to cross it with awareness, knowing that the darkness is not the end, but the womb of a new consciousness. And you? Can you recognize any bardo you're going through right now? The persona and anxiety, when the mask becomes too heavy. From a very young age, we learn to wear masks, to be accepted, praised, loved. We create a social version of ourselves. Jung called this version the persona. The persona is not necessarily a bad thing. It is useful. It's the face we show the world, the role we play in society. But the problem begins when we mistake the persona for who we truly are. Carl Jung said, "The persona is merely a compromise between the individual and society. But it is dangerous to believe it is the true personality." Now imagine being trapped in a mask for too long. The mask of the strong one, the successful one, the nice one, the spiritual one. Little by little, this mask begins to suffocate who you really are inside. And when the true self tries to emerge, even subtly, the persona resists. And what is born from this internal conflict? Anxiety. Let's bring this to real life. A mother who lives only for her children, but feels guilty for wanting time for herself. A therapist who guides so many but never finds space for their own pain. Or that professional who seems to have everything, status, career, prestige, but lives with insomnia and an unexplainable exhaustion. These are signs of an overloaded persona and an inner self crying out for authenticity. Anxiety in this case can be seen as an urgent call to reconnect with your truth, with your essence. That's why Jung didn't propose eliminating the persona, but integrating it, using it as a bridge, not a prison. So here's a powerful question. Which mask have you worn for so long that you've forgotten what your true face looks like? The shadow's confrontation as the key to transformation. Have you ever caught yourself overreacting to something small, or felt anger, envy, or fear that didn't align with who you think you are? These are signs that your shadow may be manifesting. Carl Jung's view, the shadow is made up of everything the ego rejects, hides, or denies: emotions, desires, impulses, memories. But it doesn't disappear just because it's hidden. On the contrary, the more we ignore the shadow, the more power it gains over us. Carl Jung said, "The shadow is that part of us we wish others wouldn't see, and that often we ourselves deny." Anxiety often arises as the alarm triggered by this neglected shadow. It appears when we repress certain aspects of ourselves for so long that they finally explode in confusing, painful, or uncontrolled ways. Let's imagine 3 examples. Someone taught to never be selfish may end up neglecting their own needs until their body screams through anxiety. Someone who learned to never feel anger may become too passive until they explode in panic attacks at the slightest confrontation. Or someone conditioned to always be rational, but who hides deep sensitivity. This rejected sensitivity may become a source of inner suffering, blocking spontaneity and joy. Jung said that no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Shadow integration, therefore, is not a punishment. It is a sacred process of inner liberation. And when we acknowledge our shadow, something incredible happens. Emotions stop being monsters and become messengers. Anxiety transforms into a compass, and fear loses its power because we finally find the courage to look inward with truth. So think carefully. What in you has been constantly avoided and might now be ready to be embraced? Individuation as the path to healing anxiety. If anxiety is a sign that something within us is out of balance, then the cure is not in suppressing symptoms, but in beginning a journey of integration. For Jung, this journey has a name: individuation. Individuation is the process of becoming who you truly are. It is the reconciliation of inner opposites, conscious and unconscious, reason and emotion, persona and shadow, ego and self. Carl Jung said, "To individuate is to become an indivisible being, whole, complete. But beware, this process is not comfortable. In fact, it often begins with what Jung called the dark night of the soul, periods of crisis, emptiness, confusion, and it is precisely there that anxiety tends to appear. Not as a mistake, but as an invitation from the unconscious to transform. The individuation journey requires that a person acknowledge their masks and ask, "What do I pretend to be?" Face their shadow and question, "What am I afraid to admit?" Observe their dreams, symptoms, and impulses with curiosity, not judgment. Cultivate inner dialogue with the animus, the anima, the archetypes that arise as guides in the process. It is a path of deep self-discovery, but also of freedom. People who walk this path begin to see anxiety not as an enemy, but as a call to authenticity. It signals the moment when the ego can no longer sustain a way of life that denies the soul, and each step toward individuation is a step toward a more coherent, whole, and alive life. So I ask you gently, which parts of you are waiting to be acknowledged so you can finally feel whole? The death of the ego and the birth of consciousness. Imagine a snake shedding its skin, or a butterfly struggling to leave its cocoon, or even someone who must lose everything they thought they were to finally discover who they are. These images perfectly describe what Jung called the symbolic death of the ego, an inevitable process for the emergence of true consciousness. The ego is important, of course. It organizes experience, gives meaning to the I in daily life. But when the ego becomes a tyrant, when it believes it is the center of everything, it begins to suffocate the soul. Carl Jung said, "Life does not happen to you, it happens from you." In the context of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the death of the physical body is a moment of transition. But Jung invites us to see beyond. What if true liberation comes not only in physical death, but in the death of the ego while we are still alive? This process is not easy. It is confusing, painful, full of ruptures. You may feel like you're losing control, like nothing makes sense anymore. But perhaps this isn't collapse. Perhaps it is initiation. Anxiety, in this context, reveals itself as the symptom of an ego being challenged to yield. The soul wants space, consciousness wants to be born, and the ego resists. That's why this moment demands courage. Courage to let go of the image you've built of yourself. Courage to allow parts to die so others can be born. So here's a crucial question. What are you still trying to control that perhaps simply needs to die? The dance of anima and animus, reconnecting with wholeness. Within each of us there is an inner feminine and an inner masculine. Carl Jung called these forces anima, the feminine in a man's psyche, and animus, the masculine in a woman's psyche. But today, in a broader view, these concepts can be seen as complementary energies that live in all of us. Regardless of gender, The anima represents intuition, receptivity, sensitivity, connection with the inner world. The animus represents action, logic, direction, the ability to assert oneself in the world. Carl Jung said, "The union of opposites is the goal of the individuation process. When these forces are imbalanced, anxiety can flourish. For example, a person dominated by the animus may become overly rigid, controlling, trapped in doing, and disconnected from emotions. Result? A deep, existential fatigue, an anguish that arises even when everything is going well. A person dominated by the anima may become overly dreamy, emotional, vulnerable to instability, which can also lead to panic attacks, insecurity, and paralysis. The path to healing here is not choosing one side, but recognizing both within oneself. It's allowing the masculine to bring structure without suffocating sensitivity, and the feminine to bring warmth without distancing us from action. In the Bardo Thodol, this integration appears symbolically in encounters with gods and goddesses, expressions of the psyche's light and dark aspects. Jung saw this as a reflection of the inner journey of integration. When anima and animus dance in harmony, you feel more presence, less anxiety, more clarity, more peace. So I ask you gently, which of these forces have you been neglecting and might now be asking to be heard? The soul's time, the art of listening to silence. We live in a world that demands speed, productivity, immediate answers, but the soul, it moves at a different pace. Carl Jung said, "The soul demands time, and the time it demands is sacred." Often, anxiety arises from the friction between these two times, the time of the mind, fast, restless, and the time of the soul, deep, silent. Jung knew that healing doesn't come only from doing. It often emerges when we have the courage to stay with what we feel without trying to escape, when we learn to dwell in silence without getting lost in it, when we let the emptiness speak. In the Tibetan Book of the Dead, there is a moment when the soul encounters the space between thoughts, a neutral field, a place of pure potentiality. Jung saw this state as similar to what we experience when we silence the ego's noise and listen to the wisdom of the unconscious. But how to cultivate this in daily life? Through meditation, yes, but also active contemplation, observing a tree, journaling, walking in silence, in a simple ritual like lighting a candle and breathing, or in an honest conversation with your own heart, in the dark of your room, before sleep. These moments may seem like nothing, but they are everything. It is in these empty spaces that the soul whispers. It is there that anxiety begins to lose its grip, because you're no longer fighting it, you're listening to what it wants to say. So, I leave you with a gentle question. What space of silence have you been denying yourself? That might be exactly where your healing is waiting. The inner journey, the true secret to ending anxiety. If you've made it this far, you've realized the Tibetan secret Jung revealed to us is not a magic formula. It's not a quick trick. It's a journey, a deep voyage into yourself. The Tibetan Book of the Dead teaches that after death, we face our projections, our fears, desires, illusions. Jung translated this wisdom for life. We live surrounded by our ego's projections. And anxiety is born when we forget that we are more than what we fear. Carl Jung said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." Ending anxiety, then, is not about fighting it, it's about crossing through it, seeing what it hides, accepting that to be reborn, some parts of us must die. This passage involves recognizing your shadows and embracing them, allowing the ego to dissolve when necessary, balancing your inner forces like anima and animus, honoring the soul's time, even when the mind screams for haste, and above all, remembering you're not alone on this journey. We all go through this. We all carry within us both gods and demons, and it is in accepting this complexity that we find peace. So to close, I invite you to reflect. If you stopped fighting who you are, what could blossom in its place? Perhaps true freedom is closer than you think. Perhaps it's right there now, waiting for you within your own being. A whisper from the soul. If you felt something during this journey, a lump in your throat, a deeper sigh, a silence that embraced you, then perhaps your soul is awakening. The path Jung presents is not linear. It has no shortcuts, but it is real. And it begins when you choose to listen to what's inside you. Anxiety doesn't have to be an enemy. It can be a messenger, a call, an invitation to reunite with what was forgotten, but was always there, your deepest essence. And if you remember this even on the hard days, you'll already be much closer to something no technique can offer, the peace of being whole. Before you go, tell me in the comments, which part of this journey spoke to you the most today? Was it the confrontation with the shadows, the death of the ego, or the silence of the soul? Your answer may inspire others who are also searching for meaning, and if this video touched you in any way, share it with someone else struggling with anxiety.